Welcome to Attachment Matters, a series of conversations between two moms who love to nerd out on the subject of attachment. We'll dive into what it is, what it isn't, what it relates to, what it can mean for parenting, and how it can help us explain the current state of things.
As mothers, both of us found ourselves entangled in the world of gender ideology, following very different routes to get here. What we share in common is how the attachment framework has helped us to untangle these threads and better understand and fulfill our responsibilities as mothers in both the beauty and the challenge of these times.
In this Q&A episode, Rose and I talk about our tendency as moms to get in the weeds as we try to make sense of our children's behavior and determine the right response. We offer a guiding principle here to help you keep it simple, and we emphasize the importance of vulnerability and processing our inevitable grief. We also encourage parents to see difficult incidents with our children as opportunities to learn more about ourselves so that we can integrate and live healthier lives, making a positive impact on the whole family system. Welcome to episode 13 of Attachment Matters. This is, excuse me, part 2 of our Q&A where we are answering submitted questions. Hi, Rose.
Hi, welcome.
Seems like it's been a bit.
It has been.
Yeah. Um, so the questions that are submitted, they come from the S&P Center, which is an online community that is hosted by the Stoic Mom Project. And it is a refuge from the culture war and a resource center for moms who are committed or who have prioritized strengthening the attachment with their trans ID'd kids so that they're clear that that is their focus and they are part of this community where resources are offered and support is offered to that end. And so that's who we go to for these questions. We answered most of them in episode 12, and there are two left that are pretty beefy and will give us a lot to talk about.
Sounds great.
So, yeah, this first one I think is a great one to kind of recap a lot of what we covered in episode 12. Would you like to read that one?
Yeah, absolutely. The growing edge.
Yes.
Okay. So the question reads, my growing edge is in navigating young adult differentiation, figuring out how much interaction what I would normally have had without the trans medicalization, and now being aware of the medicalization as a complicating factor. Part of accepting what I can and cannot control is the dynamic of me inevitably representing failure and or despair on her part, as she can never actually achieve being the opposite sex. I am mom, the biological woman she is avoiding being like. Offering myself as a consultant has been a helpful concept, and me needing to be the alpha and showing up to offer this consultation by being present through remote contact and in person when possible, rather than waiting for her to come to me. She has drawn the boundary of me not mentioning trans medicalization issues anymore, which makes that simpler for me, I suppose. I'm necessarily excluded from that area of her life. I don't know that I have a question other than acknowledging and exploring this dynamic in the episode.
Yeah. And I will say this is a very common dynamic and experience among moms that I work with,
Mm,
for
mm.
sure. You know,
I,
this, yeah, go ahead. Mhm.
I was going to say, try to put it in your own words if you'd be willing, just to have everyone hear it a second time, maybe just in different wording.
Mhm. Well, and there's a lot going on here. And so
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
we've got a few things to look at.
Let's break it down.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to do is review something that I've mentioned in a previous episode, and that is that I think for many of these families, there was pretty strong attachment.
Right.
Um, and these cultural influences
Yes.
that make it so much harder to maintain that attachment,
Yep.
and when we're dealing with these kids who have to manage some pretty intense cognitive dissonance,
Yeah.
that is going to necessarily distance them from us
Yeah.
because to be around us
Yeah.
is to have to allow some of that, right? To feel some of that, to
Yeah.
have to suppress, I think, that reality that is present and in their face when they're around their moms who
Yep.
don't buy into their identity or their
Yep.
parents,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And so
Yep.
they're going to avoid us to some extent because that is painful,
Yeah.
uncomfortable,
Yep.
not conscious.
Yep.
These are unconscious drivers of behavior. So there's that.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's the um, I see also in this mom's vigilance, which I think is also
Mm.
very common among the moms that I
Mm-hmm.
work with
Mm-hmm.
anyway, or that come to the
Mm-hmm.
Stoic Mom Project. They're highly attuned.
Mm.
They want to do things right.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're assessing,
Yeah.
they're assessing how often the child is coming. They're trying to make meaning of that. They're measuring it against standards. They're trying to see how much of this is attributable to the identity versus what's normal, differentiation. And so they're
Right.
really stuck in their
Yes.
heads, um, and judging themselves against those standards
Yeah.
rather than resting into that alpha mode
Mm.
of
Mm.
none of that really
Mm.
matters.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think they don't know that. That's something we can share with them,
Right.
that
Right.
if you can just have this maybe guiding principle of I'm the mom, therefore I'm the alpha, therefore the
Yeah.
connection is my responsibility. It's that simple.
100. Oh, I love how you just said that. So many things come to mind as I hear you breaking this down, and I appreciate how you've given us kind of a second go at what you see happening here to hear it a second time. Um, I couldn't agree more, and I did kind of say, before we started recording, like I have this, yearning to share more of my own story, and
Mm,
as you're speaking, I just want to say I agree with what you're saying when I think about my own teen years, early 20s, I did have a strong attachment to my parents. I absolutely did. I did have extremely competing attachments with my
mm,
peers and with the culture at large that were absolutely exacerbated when I went away to college. But you are so right to say um, that there was just I think we've talked about this before, almost like this is the water I am swimming in. I was
mhm,
swimming in that water of attachment to
mhm,
my parents. I took it for granted. I didn't even see it. I yearned for it always. um, but the forces that kind of gave me, this alternative viewpoint of the world ideologically were so embedded in the attachments I developed that were in
mhm,
competition with that those ultimately won, for a period of probably 20 years of my life.
mhm,
Um, so I just want to say, yes, what you're saying with, I can take that in today and say, wow, that was also true for me and my relationship to my parents, that we did have that. And there were so many forces that were pulling me um, to out of it,
mhm,
or in
mhm,
competition with it, even though my yearning was to be nested in that hierarchy of their alpha presence. That was my yearning. And I agree too with what you're saying, on that second piece you spoke to so much. Because I'm trying, at the same time, I'm imagining what could my own parents have done differently with me as I drifted apart. And I started to question, because I think a lot of this, coming into a trans identification is, please tell me if I'm wrong, but it's just so often within a broader context of, you know, um, the social justice
Hmm.
mindset
Hmm.
and the woke mindset, and which is essentially telling a person like myself, you know, the reality that you've been embedded with your whole life, that has loved and nurtured you and given you all these opportunities, is inherently wrong.
Hmm.
It's inherently unjust. It's inherently um, stopping us from living in a better world. And it's up to us to really transform that, you know, um, that background that we took for granted into something that's going to promise so much more. This vision of social justice. So it's, I can feel it as you're talking. When I would go home in college, that sense that like my parents just haven't woken up yet.
Hmm. Hmm.
They just don't understand yet.
Hmm. Hmm.
I do. They don't.
Yes.
I mean, that is such a hard way to interface. And so I'm hearing you say you got to get out of your head and just be the alpha, just provide
Hmm.
the care, provide the nurturing, provide the play. The connection is your responsibility. I'm like, I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with you more, because there's so much that you can't do anything about
Right.
when you get in the
Right.
weeds.
Right. And it's interesting, as I listen to you, it transports me back also to a similar experience. I moved away from my family when I was 20, far away to the city, you know, and um, I remember sitting in my college courses. I was actually in my mid-20s when I went back to college, and my world just crumbling around me. My foundations swept out from underneath me as I learned about the world
Yeah.
and how different it was from what I thought it was based on my upbringing. And that
Yeah.
same sense about my parents that they were just uninformed, ignorant, old-fashioned, didn't really understand what was going on around the world. And yeah, that we were moving in a different direction away from the belief system I grew up in, that
Mm-hmm.
was um irrelevant, right? Or what's the word? Like, yeah, I guess it had lost its relevance.
Passe. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And unhelpful,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so feeling that distance, but I think I did always rest in that hierarchical uh, attachment, though, that you
Yeah.
describe. Like that never
Yeah.
felt really threatened to me,
Right.
even though I did see myself as, I wouldn't say a black sheep, but definitely different.
Yeah.
And 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 I'm wondering too if this is a temperament. We talk often about these kids that seem more vulnerable to this, and that high sensitivity and that neuro atypical brain, you
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
we
Mm-hmm.
just move through the world a little differently. And I know for myself, I was going to learn things the hard way.
Yeah.
And I spotted that in my daughter pretty early on, that she was naturally resistant to being told what to do. And I've questioned whether that made her an alpha child. And maybe at times I can see when the identity first came into our communication, it
Mm-hmm.
had kind of been hovering
Mm-hmm.
on the fringes for a while, but she and I were now communicating about it. And I definitely went into seeker mode.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I think I can go back to those times and those interactions and my desperation.
Yeah, I know.
But the temperament thing has been on my mind, and maybe we table that for another conversation. But Yeah, I definitely
I
have a
do.
lot of curiosity about that.
I
So,
do too.
okay.
Yeah, I do too.
So we'll hold that
Yeah,
for future conversations.
yeah,
But hopefully moms can also take themselves back.
yeah.
And not all moms might relate to that experience,
Right,
but I think in many times these kids don't fall that far from the tree, you
right.
know?
The what we get into might be different based on the culture around us and
Yes.
the forces at play, for sure. But
Yes.
I think that
Yes.
inquisitive, gifted mind,
Hmm.
and kind of like, depending on how alarmed we are at our, there's just different things that go, yeah. Table it for another time, but I could talk about that for hours.
Well, and
The
honestly,
temperament
again,
question.
right,
Yeah.
in answering this question, none of that matters either. Not
No,
really.
it doesn't. It doesn't. You're so right. It's interesting. It's
Uh-huh.
fascinating,
Uh-huh.
but you are so right. At the end of the day, you are responsible for the connection, prioritizing the relationship to your child. And here in this question, I see my daughter said, you can't talk about it.
Right.
And
Right.
and for
The
me,
daughter
I'm
has set
like,
a boundary. Hmm.
then you have to honor that boundary. And
Hmm.
sounds like this mom is. Um, but how are all that in some ways it's like now the work is the relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. And recognizing when you're in alarm, I think,
Mm,
that a lot of this assessing can scare us if our child does not seem to be responding to our
mm-hmm,
efforts
mm-hmm.
to keep the attachment healthy and to stay
Yeah.
connected. And I think this actually is a good segue into the next question,
Okay.
about because that alarm will put us into seeker mode, I think, and we want so badly for the connection
Mm-hmm.
to work. And we're, again, highly attuned and we're looking for evidence that our efforts are working,
Mm-hmm.
and if we're not seeing that,
Mm-hmm.
then
Mm-hmm.
then I think we do what this mom is doing, where she's really uh she's in her head, right? She's trying to
Yeah,
make sense. That's what we're doing, right? We're pursuing
totally.
sense. We're trying to understand the situation, but that takes us out of presence, I think,
Yeah.
and connection even. So it's funny,
Yeah.
the spirals.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, the beginning of this question before we move on to the next one is just, this idea of the young adult differentiation is like, yeah, it's that I do think, it's not to say don't think about this stuff or try to understand it. I mean, that's my whole, I am just
Hmm.
always, that's the whole reason
Me
I'm
too.
here,
Yep.
It's because I'm trying to understand all
Yes.
these things about my children. And then that inspired me to better understand myself and my own mother and parents. And, so yes, I mean, what a gift it is to be able to ask these questions,
Hmm.
and use our mind to try to figure them
Hmm.
out. Um, but I think if it helps to kind of bring some rest, it is leaning into that. How do I, you know, just return to relationship?
Hmm.
That no matter what process may be going on for my child, it could be one of many or multiple at the same
Yes.
time.
Yes.
How how can I stand from a place where I am going to be there for them, no matter what? And, how do I show up? How do I show up? And it might take a long time to then look
Hmm.
back
Hmm.
retrospectively and say, oh, this was this aspect. This might have been this other aspect, and I think a lot of it is also the grief, and we can move on to this next question, but
Yeah.
where are you finding your tears?
Hmm.
Because if your daughter has medicalized, there is an, I mean, I'm don't have to say this to parents. There is an ocean of grief.
Yes. Yes.
because you
Yes.
have to stretch yourself so big to maintain that connection that you have to interact with your own child who doesn't sound the same, look the same, doesn't have the same name. There is so much loss
Yes.
that you have to feel at the same time as you stay close.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. And so important. Who helps you hold that grief? Yeah.
It makes me cry.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're going to transition a little bit now to sort of a different question. And I'm going to paraphrase it, do my best to. Um, so this mom is asking about the issue of being alpha versus a doormat. And wondering about like, is what should we be expecting from our children? How they might engage with us emotionally or respond to something that we're bringing to them without us then kind of seeking that response from them or engaging in seeking behavior. And she clarifies here, this is, we're talking about our adult children. So she goes on to share an example from a friend of hers that went to share some really hard news from her own life with her son as he was playing a video game. So the son is there playing the video game, and her friend, the son's mother, comes to share that someone very close to her has died. Okay, and her son didn't respond. He didn't break his concentration on the video game to acknowledge what his mother was sharing, this tragic news that his mother was sharing with him. She goes on to say that the mother was hurt and enraged. Um, and she says, I don't think this mom was engaging in seeker activity to expect him to put down the game and respond to her, to engage with her and pay attention. And so the same mom says, is this unreasonable? I want to know. I do find that when my kids blow me off on things like this, whether it is just giving me attention or basic relational empathy, that this is a huge trigger for me. And so, one way or another, I want to unpack this for myself.
Yeah. So I got permission from this mom to bring this one to the Q&A. She didn't specifically submit it for this reason, but she said um, she did give me permission. And I responded to her in the community with something on my mind that had come from our conversations about the potential of the child being defended
Mm,
against the mother.
mm,
And that perceived lack of empathy, right? Like
mm,
I think
mhm,
that's what both the author of the question and the mother in the example were experiencing was a lack
mhm.
of normal human empathy. And that's also going to be alarming for us as parents.
Oh, yeah.
Um, but I was really grateful when later that same day, one of my leadership team jumped on and acknowledged that the son was playing a video game.
Yeah.
And I had had that same thought and and was going to return to it to this question to acknowledge that. Like I wouldn't if I'm going to set my son up for success, and this is something we navigate in our house. He's 17 years old. He loves his video games. I don't try to interact with him when he's deeply engaged in a game. If I need his attention, I'll let him know, "Hey, hun, when you have a stopping point, could you come find me? I have something I need to talk with you about." Um, Otherwise, it's an exercise in frustration. I'm talking to the back of his
Totally.
head, you know, and he's frustrated with me trying to, because I'm interrupting something that's really important to him.
Yeah.
We don't see it that way. Video games seem trivial. Many of us have some harsh judgments around video games. And so this can just be an exercise in frustration if that
Mhm.
is how you're approaching somebody who is deeply engaged in a video game and you
Yep.
think video games are bad or you know what I'm saying?
Oh,
Like,
yes. If you're already like, I hate this video
yes,
game, I
yes,
hate it. I don't want to play in it.
right.
It's not working. It's already not working.
And now I've got even more evidence that this is
Oh,
harmful because he can't even put his video game down to acknowledge my pain.
yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And he owes me something. I don't know if this
Mm,
is what was happening in that example or if this is what the mother who shared it with you was feeling when she was speaking to kind of her own triggers around this. And I think
mm,
I've shared this in past episodes. Whenever I'm like, I've done so much for you, I
mm, mhm,
I I transgressed my own boundaries and let you do something, and then
mhm,
I don't get the behavior I want. I take it so personally.
mm,
I
mhm,
am so
mhm,
wounded and
mm,
I act like a child in response. Like, how dare you do this to me?
mhm.
You've betrayed me, my child, because you didn't act the way you should have. I feel like I go right into,
Yeah.
this personal wounding zone.
Yeah. Which I, you say I act like a child, but I don't know that I've ever seen a child quite act that way. That sounds like
That's
something
probably
grown-ups do,
true.
you
Yeah,
know.
that's yeah, parents. Probably just parents.
Yes.
Yeah, really.
Yes.
Or
And
maybe
it is,
grandparents. Yeah.
I think that is our go-to emotional response. That is
Yeah.
what gets triggered,
Yeah.
right? Is that sense of betrayal and and I do think there's this fear of, oh, my kid has no empathy.
I failed.
Yes. I think
It
that's
is
what it
you're
brings alive in us. Yes.
totally a 100%. I've said this out loud. My partner has said this out loud.
Mm-hmm.
Does our child have no empathy? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yep. So as you're giving this example, I couldn't agree more about the video game because we just think about it. Um, we have to understand this is just kind of nerding out about video games for a moment, but video games are created to work the attachment circuitry.
Mm,
That's why they're so addictive.
mm-hmm.
They are 100% in the rewards circuitry of the brain, which is a
Mm-hmm.
depersonalized attachment
Mm-hmm.
operating on significance and mattering. Like we go back to the roots,
Yes.
significance and mattering is our internal reward system. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
whether it's the social media and the notifications and the likes, or it's a video game, a numerical outcome is an instant reward. It is pumping that part of our attachment brain.
Okay.
So our focus and our attention is glued.
Yes.
It is impenetrable. And it's not necessarily that the son is ignoring mom because he's defended against her
Right.
at a fundamental level, but in that moment he is.
Mm,
He could very likely be in what's called defensive detachment because if we think of our attachment as a magnet with two polar ends,
mm-hmm.
if we are being drawn to that video game on the end that's attaching, sticking, the opposite end is pushing away.
Right. Right. Oh yeah, that's a great visual. Uh-huh.
So attempting to engage attachment, when you're on the other side of that magnet, you are going to get a repelling response. It's not willful. Again, this is about instinct. This is about how our brains are the attachment brain works. So what you're
Yes.
saying about have the conversation at a different time or if you have to have it at that moment, if there's some urgent reason,
Mm-hmm.
there's a crisis happening, you need attention at that moment, you can say, "Hey, there is there's something that I absolutely need your attention for right now. I know it's hard for you to put this down, but I'm giving you 5 more minutes and then I need to talk to you." You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
if it is an actual crisis, if it
Right.
is your tragedy,
Mm-hmm.
it do you need him right at that moment? Really?
Right.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't have that answer, but
Well,
I
you
think
said something interesting, and you said, "Do you need him?" And I think that's really what she's wanting an answer to. Is this
yeah,
seeker behavior,
right, right.
Hmm.
We can talk about the empathy thing. Yeah, and yes, exactly. If you feel that you need your adult child to soothe your tragic loss immediately, I don't know. I maybe I'm not seeing something here, and maybe I am being too harsh. And if it was me in this situation, I'd feel much differently. I don't know, but I just don't see our children as being the ones that need to play that role.
Yeah.
I just don't. I think it's our spouse. I think it's our parents. I
Hmm.
think it's
Hmm.
our
Friends.
equals
Hmm.
or those who we lean on and
Hmm.
depend on. But we shouldn't be depending on our children, even if they're adults.
And I will say, I think I did a little of this. And when I put myself back in these moments, I do think I was testing the empathy.
Yeah,
I was going
interesting.
in to see what the response was going to be.
Yeah, testing. Ooh,
Mind you, like these were, I also needed to deliver the information
totally.
because these were family members. I lost a nephew
Oh, yeah. 100%.
that my kids didn't know very well
Yeah.
at all. They hadn't seen him for over a decade, so they were really little when they did know him. And yeah, there was that time, and it was I did get a response. My son was very
Mm-hmm.
empathetic, but he
Mm-hmm.
wasn't in the middle of a
Mm-hmm.
video game. But he did jump up and give me a hug. And my daughter was a little stumped, it seemed like. I actually
Mm-hmm.
wrote about this in one of my pieces, and I was mistaken what was going on for her. So I think that's important too.
Mm-hmm.
She kind of stood in her doorway. She didn't move toward me. She just seemed a little like I lost her. Like
Mm-hmm.
she went somewhere emotionally in her mind, and
Mm-hmm.
I perceived it as a lack of empathy.
Yeah.
But I found out later she was having a really interesting thought in that moment.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about what I thought it was. It wasn't this lack of empathy that I saw. So I think
Yeah.
that's really important too. We we weave stories, we
Yeah.
make
Yeah.
meaning. Our brains do it super quick. It's what they're designed to do,
Yeah.
and that we have to be careful with that and be aware of
Yeah.
our own stories and that we might be wrong,
Yeah.
you
It takes
know.
me back to that the whole conversation we had about respect and disrespect in a previous episode.
Hmm.
And you know, Neufeld the Neufeld Institute just is releasing this fall a whole course on the roots of empathy.
Mm.
And and
Hmm.
and the reality is that empathy in and of itself cannot be taught.
Right.
It's
Right.
part of that whole behavioral learning theory culture that we are swimming in like goldfish in a little fishbowl. We
Hmm.
don't even know the theory we're operating on or the belief that we're operating on, the worldview we're operating on when we think that we need to teach our children empathy. And if they don't respond with empathy, that there's something wrong with them.
Hmm.
It is a developmental outcome
Hmm. Hmm.
that
Hmm.
and the reality is that when we talk about the maturation process, which I hope we're going to be diving into, more, not less, as we go forward with this podcast, um, when you are not yet at that place of integrative, when
Hmm.
the brain, the prefrontal cortex hasn't been able to say, I can have on the one hand, on the other hand,
Mhm.
I am angry, but I care about this person. I am really into this video game, but I want to respond to my mom. Whatever it may
Mhm.
be in that moment, um, the the developmental job is for someone to actually be self-centered. The
Mm.
I has to exist
Mhm.
and have integrity before you can hold kind of this um, someone else's perspective. And we are just culturally at this time just pummeling our young children
Mhm.
with teaching empathy, which is essentially saying, don't care about yourself, don't become your own person,
Mm.
because they can't be both at once. They can
Right.
only be one at a time. And I feel like whether it's the social emotional learning in the schools, whether it's the parenting, that we are just so panicked that we have to make our kids be good people,
Mhm.
you know, get along with other children, or respect us, whatever it is, we don't understand that developmental process, that empathy is a fruit. It's a
Mhm.
fruit. It's not the bottom. It's not the beginning point. I think that children are so empathetic, they're so naturally empathetic, but we have to understand that if they're not at that place of integrative functioning, they can't hold two different perspectives at the same time. Um, and if we're telling them, unless you hold my perspective,
Mhm.
there's something wrong with you.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
What we are essentially doing is telling our children not to have their own internal compass for what they feel and think.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Well, so anyways, I was just on a big soapbox. So
Well, and
I say this as a um
I'm just I think it's important information, and how do we make that something actionable or
so yeah, thank you. So when I think about this story, there's so much we don't know. We don't know what's going on
yes.
every day. What's the backdrop? What is their dynamic like when he's not playing a video game? So it's like that video game aspect, what you talked about. It's a huge piece of this that
Mm-hmm.
if we had a different scenario, maybe there would be different information, to understand about the dynamic here. But I think in general, exactly what you're saying right now, how do we have a bigger takeaway?
Mm-hmm.
My bigger
Mm-hmm.
takeaway at its core would be to say we are very focused on incidents, and incidents are essentially symptoms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in any given incident, we can ask, well, what was the root of how this played out? What was the antecedent?
Yeah. Yeah.
And just kind of take that step back and say, um, is there a way that I set myself up here?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Instead of saying my child is failing, you know, is there a way that I kind of walked into this and set it up for this to happen, even though I
Mm-hmm.
didn't realize it in the moment?
Right. Right. Yeah. I don't love the word symptoms. I
Mm-hmm.
get it, that we
Mm-hmm.
need to
Mm-hmm.
we need to think differently about the incidents, these things that trigger us,
Mm-hmm.
are opportunities,
Yeah.
to understand the dynamic and look at our own role in the dynamic, which is what I'm hearing you say. Like, what questions are you asking yourself? So much of this is happening on an unconscious level.
Totally.
We these incidents happen, they trigger us. The story already exists in our mind, and what is our capacity, I think, to pause, examine our own narrative about what's going on,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is what I'm
Mm-hmm.
hearing you say, right? And then how can we use that information moving forward?
Yeah.
When I think what often happens unconsciously is we are triggered because the story that we're holding is we failed. My kid is not responding properly to whatever, and
Yeah.
that means I failed as a mom.
Even when we're
And
not aware that that's what's going on for us,
yes,
that's underneath a lot of our trigger
yes,
reaction. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
I don't know if this is helpful at all, but I think I shared this story at a previous episode where I I was very it was I believe my son was like 7 and his younger brother was my younger son was 5, and I had all the Neufeld, videos telling me, well, the preschooler doesn't have integrative functioning, but once the child hits that 5 to 7,
Mm,
mark, they're going to start integrating more, have more impulse control, be able to share, And
mm-hmm,
so I'm thinking, um, talk about like the analytical mind, I'm as much as I don't want to be in this place, I'm like, oh, he's 7.
mm-hmm,
And I had a plate of popcorn and I was at my in-laws, and these two always fought. I mean, the competition between my sons is so intense, so intense. They're close in age. They are almost never able to rest in an age hierarchy. It's the rivalry and the competition is just such a dynamic in their relationship. So I take the plate of popcorn out to the table and I'm thinking, my older son, better be able to share.
mm. You're testing.
I'm testing. And I'm operating on this assumption that like
Mm-hmm,
he should be capable of this.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And it was just instantaneous. Him trying to grab more. He's like in survival mode, and I do this too. Like, I'm not going to have enough food. I don't know if it's like our blood sugar levels. I don't know what it is, but it's like
mm-hmm,
if I'm going to die if I don't have enough popcorn. And so he's just grabbing all the popcorn,
mm-hmm,
because he's going to die if he doesn't get enough. And and then my younger son is screaming and he's taking my popcorn, and I explode.
mm-hmm,
And it is we go into total meltdown, and my son, the defenses kick in. He is screaming. He is
mm-hmm,
locked into this, defensive detachment with me. And I'm sitting there in this mess, and I'm saying, oh, I it was kind of like the Neufeld didn't help me enough to 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 not set myself up for this, but I
uh-huh.
could then look back and say, okay, how did this start?
Yeah.
And it started with me testing. It
Mm-hmm,
started with me, what happens? I'm going to give him this plate of popcorn and he should be able to share. And I will tell you, even though I am far from perfect, our life as a family and my relationship to my children has improved
mm-hmm,
significantly since I stopped setting myself up.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it's not perfect. It's not that I don't still fall into those patterns,
Yeah,
but it
same.
has made a world of difference.
Mm-hmm. I still will set myself up with my son sometimes.
Totally.
Yeah,
How can we? I mean, it's going to be part of the program,
yeah,
but at least we can
yes,
see it faster.
right. Yes. Well, and I think again, it's those opportunities
Yeah.
because that is important information, you know,
Yep.
that you can use to stabilize yourself, create inner peace, show up differently next time. What
Yep.
is brought alive in you during these incidents is amazing information.
Yeah, it sure is.
I think that the reorientation here is to see them as opportunities.
Yeah. Totally. And to not, because think about this for a second. When I go back to those moments of those just high intensity um, our struggles. If I, it's like, I'm sorry, but like by the grace of God, I wasn't in a place where I then said, my child is mentally ill.
Mm-hmm.
My child
Mm-hmm.
is flawed. My child needs a therapist. Like, thank God. Because, my partner and I look back, trying to understand, especially our older son. Both of our
Mm-hmm.
children are extremely intense, but
Mm-hmm.
especially
Mm-hmm.
him coming to understand this, we could have gone down a totally different route
Yes. Yep. Yeah.
with diagnoses and, shame.
Yes. Yes. And this came up in the last episode, in the Q&A episode about, and again, like culturally, this this makes sense. It's the expectation. It's um, what we've learned to do,
Mm-hmm.
is when our children seem really difficult, in the system, right? Like our kids we don't know what to do. We want to hand them off to somebody else to fix them.
Yep.
Yes. And if we could reorient again, I'll use that
Mm-hmm.
term to what is happening
Yeah.
and use the information to look at how we're setting ourselves up. Like you said, how did I set myself up for this?
Mm-hmm.
Or to use what comes alive in us as information, to see anytime we have one of these incidents as an opportunity to make the system more resilient, stronger,
Yeah.
relational, connected,
100%.
you know, um,
Yeah. That backdrop of the
or playing a
everyday.
different game. Yes. And our kids have more chance of
Yeah.
healthier outcomes because the family system is what leads to that,
Yeah.
a healthy family system.
Yep.
That can be difficult information.
Yeah.
I have come to this, not that I hadn't before, but it's really conscious for me right now. And I've been saying this a lot, and please hear me out here. Right? But here's the bottom line. Yes, screwed up. I screwed up.
Yeah.
We make mistakes. We
Oh, yeah.
mess up our kids.
All the time.
It's kind of our job.
Mm-hmm.
I know our
Mm-hmm.
job is also to provide that healthy attachment, but our job is also to socialize them.
Yeah.
You know, they have to be socialized, and socialization hurts the soul.
Mm-hmm.
It's damaging. And then our task is to overcome that.
Mm-hmm.
And 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 parenting is an opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
But it depends on our relationship to the incidents.
Yeah.
We can use the incidents to overcome our own childhood.
Yeah. Well, even yes, and taking the responsibility, like it
Hmm.
just brings it back to the alpha again,
Hmm. Hmm.
because when you were saying we want to take our children when we think they're difficult, or they have problems, or we're having things not work, um, and we see it as our children,
Yes.
then we go and we say, fix our child to a
Hmm.
professional. Right there, we're not alpha.
Right.
Even saying it's my child is not alpha because we need to be taking the responsibility. What are the conditions that existed prior to this incident? What was my role? What is my part that I'm not seeing yet? And it's
Hmm.
not that, especially if we're talking about older, as you know,
Hmm.
adolescents, young adults, 20 somethings, of course, there's going to be so much that wasn't us, that we couldn't control. There's always going to be the things that we can't control.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
when we talk about our relationship to our child, and especially from those younger years, you know, I do think you're saying these incidents are opportunities. I couldn't agree more. And I do think it brings us back to that opportunity to say, by taking responsibility for this relationship, by assuming that alpha role, that is, I do think, where we not only grow up, but we can heal
Yes,
from the lacks that we experienced.
yes, which all of us have,
All of us, all of us.
all of us. And part of that healing is grace for ourselves and our
Yes,
mistakes.
yes,
It's a huge part of it. And I want to remind listeners that I did this.
yeah,
I sent my child away for 3 months because it felt too big and hard for me.
yep,
There were other things that I can say these were the reasons it looked good on paper, but the bottom line is I sent her away,
yeah,
and that it did hurt the attachment,
yeah,
and I had to find a way to forgive myself
yes.
for
Oof.
that. It still hurts, right?
Yeah,
Like it's never going to stop hurting that I did that.
yeah, yep.
And that's part of the grief too, isn't it? It's to
Yes, it
it's to
is.
grieve our mistakes and to have grace for ourselves as humans. Because our kids don't, how else do they develop that grace if they don't have us modeling that?
That's right. That's right. We need to give it to ourselves and to them.
Yeah. And that's part of the healing
Hmm.
that parenting offers us.
Yeah.
And I recently watched The Arrival.
I don't know what that is.
It is an alien movie.
Nice.
And I've encouraged parents in this situation to watch it. It was my second time watching it, and for some reason the human part of the plot escaped me the first time. It did not stick with me. My kids were much younger, but there's a really important message in it about
Mm,
pain
yeah.
and and the beauty in the pain.
Yeah.
A lot of us think we would do things differently to avoid some of that pain, but it's the pain that makes life so exquisite, you
That's
know.
right. It's so
And I'm
true.
not saying go out and
Cause
expose yourself
pain.
to painful
Yeah.
things, but it's life is going to give it to you. And I
100%.
I think I think it's changing our relationship to pain is
Hmm.
what I think so many of us need to do.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, we got pretty philosophical here, didn't we?
Yeah. Well, it's
I'll get off
such
my
it.
soapbox now.
Oh no, I don't feel that way at all. I feel like you're touching upon something so important. I'm just so grateful for what you're sharing.
Um, we talked about, shall we wrap up?
Sure. There's
Okay.
one last thing we wanted to get to.
What was it?
We hadn't talked about one of the questions, the delineating between the frustration versus the alpha.
Yeah.
And if I could just say one quick thing about that, um, just as food for thought, and if I'm repeating from a past episode, forgive me. Um,
I think the repeating is necessary.
okay,
We need to
that it,
repeat things from
yep,
past episodes. Hmm.
that I just feel like it's sorry, I'm just rereading this here.
And we are going back to a question that we answered in episode 12, but we
Okay,
we realized that we needed to come back to this part of the question,
yeah,
so parents can recognize the difference between a child who's having an experience of frustration versus somebody who's stuck in alpha. Am I saying that right? Would that be
Yeah. Yep.
okay?
Yep. And for me, what I just want to be very brief because I know we do need to wrap up, but that I think, in terms of how to handle the alpha child, it is very much, I think we did touch upon this in the last episode,
Hmm.
episode
Hmm.
12. It's about how, in this case, your husband himself shifts into that alpha mode and how he can show up that way, but also understanding that at its core, if your child is stuck in that alpha, that is going to, in its essence, be in a frustration
Hmm.
because there's going to be so much not working. And especially in that shift, if something is going to be shifting in that dynamic and a lot of the alpha impulses are going to be thwarted, that's going to cause even more frustration because that impulse is so deep, it's so unconscious, it's so instinctual that it's not something that is necessarily conscious or willful. That if it starts to shift, there's going to be loads of frustration. So I think, to me, it's not like an either or, but really how do the two interplay with one another and understanding that dynamic. So
Okay. If some if somebody's in the experience of frustration, it might be a little easier though to facilitate as a parent, I would imagine, to recognize where they are in the experience and
I'd say the response would be the same because
okay.
if you're saying, wow, something is really not working for my adolescent, for my adult child,
Uh,
for my child right in this moment, you're already kind of assuming that alpha position.
okay. Hmm. Hmm.
You're already saying, I'm I am I can see this. I can identify this. You're not powerless. You're not seeking from your child. You're kind of saying, okay, I can see what's going on here. I can be in relationship to it. Okay.
Hmm.
And you don't need to know more than something is not working. There's aggression, there's frustration in the system.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it may be over time that you can parse out what it is that isn't working. Um, but ultimately, if your child's in that state of frustration, the same kind of processes are going to be at play, whether it's due to alpha complex or something else. Um, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Okay. And essentially the remedy is secure attachment. It's the
Hmm.
child feeling safe enough to go back into seeker mode
Yeah,
because they
to
trust that
have
their
their
needs are going
tears.
to be met. Right. Okay. They need to have their tears.
Yep, and that may take months, years.
Yeah.
I mean, and we'll get into that as we go on to sort of our next conversations, is that whole adaptation process and how vulnerable it is.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's not something we can willfully assert on our children or ourselves, getting to that vulnerability and that softness. It's really something that the conditions have to be created for over time.
Yeah, I look forward to digging into that.
Yeah.
Um, I think
But
we've
just,
touched on it a few times, but yeah,
yeah.
I'm really interested in that.
Hmm.
How that happens, that letting go, that
Yeah.
resting, that mhm. What are the conditions? How can, and I'm thinking for the parents
Hmm. Hmm.
here,
Hmm.
how do parents create the conditions for their own grief and adaptation? So,
Yeah. And I think it brings our conversation full circle. I was hesitant to bring
hmm.
in this last point because I was like, oh, where we were was just such a perfect ending. But I'm kind of glad that we kept going
Hmm.
because you and I have both had our tears
Hmm.
just in this episode,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I think
Hmm.
part of that being able to flow um, is that we've created those conditions over the
Mm,
course of our conversations over time,
mhm,
you know.
mhm,
And so we've kind of lived that out in our own ways together as
mm.
well, you know.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We hope you take something of value from our conversation today. Please check out the show notes for additional resources, including a prompt for reflection. We welcome your feedback in the comments and hope you join us for the next episode of Attachment Matters.